A defense board created in 1940 no longer has an American seat at the table. The Permanent Joint Board on Defense, established the year France fell to Nazi Germany, built when the threat to this continent was existential and immediate, is now paused. The United States walked away from it this week. This is not a diplomatic spat. This is not posturing. The oldest bilateral defense institution in North American history is sitting empty on the American side. The reason given in plain language from the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense: Canada has failed to make credible progress on its defense commitments. So here's the question this video is going to answer. How does a country that just announced it hit its NATO spending target for the first time in 35 years end up with its closest defense partner pausing the oldest cooperation body on the continent? Let us start with what we know for certain. Canada officially met NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target in the 2025 to 26 fiscal year, the first time it has done so since the end of the Cold War. The government announced this in March. Meanwhile, independent data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute tells a different story. That data puts Canada's actual military expenditure at 1.6% of GDP in 2025, not 2%. There is a gap between the government's number and the independently measured number. That gap matters. The Pentagon flagged something else alongside the spending question. Canada signed an agreement in 2023 to buy 88 F-35 fighter jets, a 19 billion Canadian dollar deal with Lockheed Martin. Then, after relations with Washington deteriorated, the Carney government ordered a review of that purchase. The review was supposed to be done by September 2025. It has not been completed. By the way, the Pentagon officials' exact words about the F-35 delay were prioritization of politics over our shared responsibility for North America's defense. That is a quote from a background briefing. That is what our closest ally said about us in private and then made public. Meanwhile, in Mexico, formal trade negotiations with the United States began on time. Greer's team and Mexico's negotiators had already moved into technical discussions on rules of origin, economic security, and supply chain cooperation. Canada's negotiating team is still waiting for bilateral talks to begin in earnest. Worth noting, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer confirmed publicly that CUSMA negotiations may run past the July 1st deadline, and suggested the U.S. may need to formally signal exit from the agreement just to extend the negotiating timeline. That is not a comfortable position for a country whose largest trading partner takes 76% of its exports. These are not my opinions. This is what the public record shows. The record shows that in November 2025, Ambassador Pete Hoekstra stated publicly that restarting trade talks after Canada's anti-tariff ad campaign was not going to be easy. And those are his words, not mine. The cost to Canadians, a months-long delay in formal negotiations, while Mexico moved ahead and Canada's chief negotiator described the July 1st date as a checkpoint, not a cliff, which is another way of saying the deadline passed without a deal in hand. The record shows that in January 2026, Prime Minister Carney traveled to Beijing and signed a strategic partnership with China. He described it as setting Canada up well for the New World Order. And those are his words, not mine. The cost to Canadians. The U.S. response was swift and negative. Threats of retaliation in the auto sector, new tariff concerns, and warnings that CUSMA itself could be at risk. This was the reaction from the country that buys 3/4 of what Canada sells to the world. The record shows that this same prime minister, during the 2025 election campaign, described China as Canada's biggest geopolitical risk. And those are his words, not mine. The cost to Canadians, a credibility gap in both directions. Washington now questions whether Canada is a reliable continental security partner. The China deal offers canola concessions, but at the price of deeper security exposure that the government's own 2024 defense policy warned about. Wrong on sequencing trade priorities. Wrong on understanding what the Defense Board pause would signal. Wrong on thinking China and the U.S. relationships could both be advanced in the same month without consequence. Wrong, not according to me. According to their own words and their own record, the CRTC just raised the streaming tax on foreign platforms to 15% of Canadian revenues. This is triple the 5% rate introduced just last year. The Motion Picture Association of America called this rate unprecedented, unnecessary, and discriminatory. University of Ottawa law professor Michael Geist said it puts Canada well outside international norms. Most European countries sit between 0.5% and 6%. In my view, the timing here is instructive. Canada is in the middle of the most sensitive trade negotiations in a generation with the United States. Washington has specifically flagged Canadian digital trade rules as a CUSMA irritant. And this week, our broadcast regulator chose to triple the rate. What that means, in plain English, we are negotiating at the table and simultaneously placing another item of disagreement on it. I offer that observation purely as commentary. The oldest bilateral defense board in North American history paused. Canada's measured military spending, 1.6% of GDP, according to independent data, against a claimed 2%. The F-35 review, launched in 2025, supposed to conclude by September 2025, still unresolved. CUSMA trade negotiations, lagging behind Mexico with a July 1st review deadline approaching. The streaming tax tripled from 5% to 15%, triggering a legal challenge from major U.S. platforms who say it violates CUSMA's digital trade obligations. That is not a statistic. That is a Tuesday for millions of Canadians. That is a family running a small business that exports across the border, checking the news over breakfast, and counting the number of open files with the United States. The defense file, the trade file, the digital services file, the energy file. Each one of them unsettled, each one of them requiring attention, each one of them connected to the price of getting things done in this country. That family is not panicking. They are doing the math. And the math is not simple right now. Every other G7 country is navigating a version of this pressure from Washington. So why is Canada the only one where the Defense Board, the trade talks, and the broadcast regulator all moved in the same week, and none of them in the same direction? Now, some in the media will tell you that you are being too harsh, too transactional, too focused on the mechanics of governance when the bigger picture matters more. Insert whatever framing they are using this week to redirect the conversation. But Canadians who have been paying attention already know what the record shows. You saw the F-35 review drag past its deadline. You noticed when the China trip happened, and then watched the U.S. response arrive within days. You tracked the CRTC announcement this week and thought about what it means for trade talks that are already behind schedule. You are not wrong. You are not extreme. You have simply been paying attention. Every source used in this video is verified and linked in the pinned comment below. Check them yourself. Read the Globe and Mail piece on the Defense Board briefing. Read the breakdown of the streaming tax and what it means for CUSMA compliance. Read the Hill Times analysis of the independent defense spending data. That is exactly what you should do. Tell me in the comments when you first noticed the gap between the policy announced and the policy delivered. Was it the defense numbers? Was it the trade timeline compared to Mexico's? Was it the week the CRTC and the Defense Board both made headlines simultaneously? I want to hear from you. There is a version of this conversation that ends differently. A version where a government heading into the most consequential trade review in a generation gets all of its signals pointing the same way. Where the broadcast regulator reads the room on timing, where the F-35 review reaches a conclusion before Washington uses the delay as evidence of bad faith, where the strategic partnership with China is announced with a clear account of what the security guardrails look like, where the gap between the measured defense number and the announced number gets addressed before a Pentagon official flags it publicly. That version is not fantasy. That is just coordination. What Canadians are living right now is the absence of it. A parent in Windsor who works in the auto sector does not separate the streaming tax from the CUSMA talks from the Defense Board pause. These are not separate files to them. They are all the same question. Is the government in Ottawa making decisions that make our situation more stable or less? The current focus is, in the Prime Minister's own words, on setting Canada up for the New World Order. That is real language from a real press conference in Beijing in January 2026. The language in Canadian kitchens this week is different. It is about the next contract, the next shipment, the next review, the next deadline that gets missed or met. There is a gap between those two registers. Canadians feel it when they read the news. They feel it when the Defense Board makes headlines and the trade talks are described as lagging. They feel it when the same week produces 3 separate signals to Washington that require explanation and management. Canada is not without options here. The country has leverage in energy, in critical minerals, in geography that cannot be replicated. The trade relationship with the United States has survived real disruption before and will again. The question is not whether Canada can navigate this. The question is whether the navigation is deliberate. The record shows where we are. The next set of decisions will show something else entirely. And Canadians, as they always have, will be watching closely and choosing accordingly.